Andrew Crowder, Chief Representative based in Japan and working with Tractus Asia. And Andrew joined Tractus in 2019. He brings a significant experience in economic development. He spent 16 years with the state of Washington with their Department of Commerce, and he's assisted 350 companies with combined exports of over $200 million. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics and MBA from the University of Washington. And thanks everybody for your patience.
I will share my screen here.
Yes, please.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Suzanne, Sarah, thank you so much. It's great that you've invited Tractus to be part of this series of webinars. And I certainly enjoyed hearing Commissioner Bostwick, although he sort of gave you the keys to the kingdom. He covered sort of everything. And on the basis or on the idea that repetition is the foundation of clarity, I'm going to go ahead and proceed.
Thank you.
Quickly about Tractus, we are a company that's been in business for 25 years. We're across 9 countries. We're headquartered in Asia and specialize in it. We have about 50 people. I joined Tractus in November. Previously, I worked for the United States state of Washington as a trade specialist in the Washington State Department of Commerce. And prior to that, I worked with a Japanese company that was based in Seattle, Washington. So that is who we are. I will go through the macroeconomic stuff quickly. It is mostly what Commissioner Bostwick had already covered. But 3 big things I'd like you to remember from tonight, or our audience remember from tonight, or this morning, rather, it's night my time. Small to medium enterprises can export successfully. There is excellent help available, and you should start closest to yourself. So start with Suzanne and work outward from her. So let's take a look at Japan and cover some of its most important features. Again, it's the third largest economy in the world in nominal GDP, about 6.4 trillion Canadian dollars in 2018. And consumer spending is about 70% of that. And again, Canada's trading relationship with Japan is robust. The Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership entered into force into December 2018. And it's worth noting here, I think, Commissioner Bostwick talked about values and how Japan and Canada share values. Canada, I believe, is the only G7 country with trade agreements with each of the other G7 countries. And that shows Canada's leadership in and commitment to an open and rules-based international trading system. It eliminates or reduces tariffs on a lot of important Canadian product areas that have already been covered. Do want to touch on the COVID pandemic quickly. The shape of the curve here is frightening, but again, Japan has been doing reasonably well. Widespread mask use was already a cultural norm. There's hand sanitizer everywhere. There's signage about best practices in avoiding infection everywhere. We're in the middle of a spike that peaked at about 7,000 new cases per day, but the numbers are already headed back down. But as you might expect, hospitality and tourism took a very hard hit, but there is pent-up consumer demand. It's forecast that the economy will turn positive around fourth quarter, and the economy is forecast, I think, to grow by the end of the year at about 3.4%. So that is certainly hopeful. Let's take a little bit closer look at Japan as a market and see what opportunities it affords both Canada and New Brunswick. There is a very strong market for luxury goods as well as food, household furnishings made of wood, articles made of wood, and sports and outdoor equipment. Japan imports almost 60% of its calories, so it is always looking for different sources of supply from overseas. Of course, there's a market for high-end seafood, And there's strong seasonal preferences in Japanese food culture. So, and they're willing to pay for quality. Average seafood consumption has been declining over the past few years, but it is still relatively high at about 33 kilograms per capita per year. And there is, as was mentioned, the culture of dining out and entertaining outside the home in Japan, and relatively high disposable income. Now, before I worked for the state of Washington, I worked for a Japanese company that procured fruits, vegetables, and seafood in the US Northwest. And it was very interesting for me as an American to sit across the table from another American at a packing plant in Washington State, and to ask him why the company chose to do business with Japan. And he said, he gave me a couple of reasons. He said, the Japanese are tough. They can be difficult customers, but they pay their bills on time. And sometimes they even pay their bills early. But even more than that, we know that if we can pack for the Japanese, we can pack for anyone in the world. He was basically, in some sense, using the Japanese market, his engagement with the Japanese market, to drive quality procedures through his own organization. In terms of non-food opportunities, large opportunities that are on the horizon, I believe Japan intends to build about 45 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity by 2040. So certainly there is an opportunity for Canada there in expertise in alternative energy systems. There is also a large resource off the seabed of Japan. It's a form of fossil fuel. It's methane hydrate that is located in the deep ocean. So bringing that material up and reforming it into usable fuel represents a substantial opportunity in the future that could benefit from the expertise Canada already has in retrieving fossil fuels from difficult locations and reforming them into useful products. I think it's about 10 years ago now, also the Japanese government sort of by fiat said that the three major car manufacturers, Toyota, Honda, and Nissan, should form a consortium to look at building hydrogen fueling infrastructure throughout Japan. Japan, as Germany is making a major bet on hydrogen to be a transportation fuel. So again, I believe there's substantial Canadian expertise in that field as well. Looking very quickly at sort of Japan's exports sectors and the sectors that Canada exports to Japan, we see that Canada was actually, until the end of last year, outperforming the rest of the world in a couple of its key sectors, fish and crustaceans, that sort of seafood, as well as some sort of industrial precursor or discard material that is then used to contribute to new products, and mineral fuels and mineral oils. And that finally turned negative at the end of this last year. But again, the economy is expected to pick up by the end of this year. Seafood consumption is down, as was mentioned, probably because of the decline in dining out and travel. High-end seafood, again, is consumed at hotels and hot spring resorts and at restaurants. And we expect this to pick back up. This overview of Japanese exports should illustrate a couple of large things to you. One, where you might be competing head-to-head with Japan in the rest of the world. And two, what sort of intermediate assemblies or goods Canada and New Brunswick might be able to supply that would form part of the products that Japan exports. What is useful about a data visualization like this and one that follows is that it allows for a visual grouping of similar exports and conveys an idea of magnitude at the same time. It's a good way to get a feeling for what a column of figures might mean, and would like to thank our analyst and our in-house Canadian, Paulo Guedes, for compiling these. And we're looking at now Japan imports from Canada, and we'll note a large number of natural uh, resource products. Here's what Japan imports from the rest of the world. It imports much of the same things that it exports. There's a lot of intra-industry trade, as with any advanced economy. But exceptions where Japan imports far more than it exports are foodstuffs, fuels, article of woods, and pharmaceuticals. One thing about wood is that Japan is trying very hard to meet sustainable development goals. So it's trying to drive carbon out of its building sector. It's trying to get away from using so much concrete, which produces a significant amount of GHG as it's produced around the world. And it's also trying to create a built environment and structures that actually sequester or embody carbon. So bulk timber, cross-laminated timber, those types of timber technologies where you're getting buildings of 5 to 10 stories now being built in Japan. You can walk around and see them. Canada has significant expertise, I believe, in that area of technology as well. So getting through the macro picture, let's start looking at sort of some strategies and tactics for entering the Japanese market. That's the big picture stuff. Culture, David mentioned culture right at the end of his presentation, and we can take another look at it here. In this framework that was developed by Hofstede that compares certain cultural dimensions. If you look at the sort of upper left, the Canadians are known for modesty and politeness. And I think that holds true. That holds true in most of my interactions, certainly with Canadians. But if you look on over to the right, you can take away, I think, a few things from that picture. In that picture, you see a person standing in a restaurant, very simple, very traditional, and I think that you see tradition, pride in craftsmanship, orderliness, those things, and so those are values to keep in mind. Now, if we look at Hofstede's comparison of the cultural attributes below, other than the somewhat fraught and I think dated term of masculinity, what that really denotes, I think, is aggressiveness, willingness to assert one's point of view, wanting to be sort of a hero. Certainly people of all genders can be all of those things. Where Canada and Japan really differ, or the differences are most pronounced, is in long-term orientation and uncertainty avoidance. And I think that in the case of Japan, those two things are related. Again, as was mentioned, stability in relationships is highly, highly valued, but once you establish them, they tend to last for a long time. So if you're prepared to do the work upfront and create a very solid relationship with suppliers and customers, it will tend to run for a long time. As you get ready to enter the Japanese market, again, it is highly competitive market. It's very mature. There is a stepwise process. First is a market study or assessment to identify the best opportunities in the market. You need to evaluate the product and market fit, especially consider issues of localization. That could mean everything from labeling to documentation of the product to the interface in any sort of computer program or software. And then finally, choose your channel, your route to market, and then vet your possible channel partners. I like to use the analogy of a country here. When you choose your market, the country that you choose is sort of the landscape that you traverse. And when you choose your channel, you're choosing your pathway through that terrain. And when you choose your channel partner, then you're choosing your companion on that journey. So let's look at some basics when entering Japan. When I used to present to small and medium enterprises in Japan, in Washington, particularly rural ones, I would try to sit everybody up straight at the beginning of the program by saying, I want you to remember these three things. When you're engaging in foreign trade, I want you to stay out of jail, keep your house, and have fun doing the job that you do. And I don't mean to scare people, but certainly I think one of the things you want to look at when you're entering the Japanese market is regulatory compliance. You need to be aware of different industrial standards. There's a variety of different organizations and standards that obtain. There's Japan Industrial System, there's Japan Agricultural System, there's the Food Sanitation Act for seafood. There's regulatory regimes that you should be aware of. Fortunately, your trade commissioners and your local resources can help you do this. An example of this is that when I worked for a Japanese company and we were buying vegetables from a Washington state vendor, both parties agreed to the USDA standard for that particular product. But a test for a certain contaminant yielded a weak positive reaction, say a 1 out of a scale to 5. Now, the USDA standard says that that product is saleable. Japanese import regulations, using and viewing that same standard, the USDA standard, said that a positive test of any strength meant that the product could not be landed. So there was an agreed standard and legally saleable product on the water that could not be legally landed in Japan. So it's critical to find out those sorts of details in advance. I'm happy to say that the two companies came to ultimately an amicable agreement and resumed business. And then another thing that I'd like to stress is sort of the speed of the process of engagement with a Japanese company. David mentioned it. Nemawashi, the idea of digging around the roots. Japanese companies will tend to move very, very slowly on the front end of a deal or of an interaction. And then, but once they've done all the work, built the internal consensus, checked their own capacity and their own capabilities and are ready to go, then they're ready to move quickly. My experience has been that American companies will often move very quickly to some sort of initial agreement, say an NDA, and then when it comes time to negotiate an actual contract and get things moving, then everything slows down. Contracts are examined very carefully. It takes a long time to negotiate particulars. So you're left with both sides having a perception that the other side is moving slowly. The Japanese move slowly on the front end, wonder why their partners are moving so slowly on the back end. The partners get frustrated on the front end, and then when the Japanese are ready to go, they slow things down. So being aware of that, being aware of these different speeds in the stages of a transaction can help avoid a lot of frustration on both sides. Selecting your channel and vetting your channel partner are essential to success. And, instead of stepping you through the slide, I think I'd like to just return to the theme of food that David spoke about and say that, besides choosing the country you're doing business in, choosing your channel is sort of the most important decision you'll make. For instance, food is bought in Japan in a bewildering variety of ways, in many channels. It is bought online. It's bought through membership stores, either local co-ops or companies like Costco that deliver. It's bought in convenience stores. In Japanese convenience stores, you can buy fresh vegetables. You can buy, most of the stuff to put a meal together. You can buy food in grocery stores. You can buy it in standalone specialty shops. There are high-end bakeries or high-end chocolatiers where people proudly display their diplomas. You can buy high-end food in department store basements. That is, the department store basements are basically gourmet shops where you can get wines and cheeses and side dishes. You can dine out. You can dine out at hotels and restaurants. And again, this is where a lot of high-end seafood is consumed. And also high-end food, including seafood, is given as gifts. And there are businesses in that segment that create and distribute catalogs. So there will be fewer channels for more specialized products, industrial products, but those channels will also require more technical knowledge to navigate well. So when evaluating a partner, make sure that they can cover all the channels that are relevant to your business. And generally, in a country with multiple channels and distinct regional cultures, and Japan is certainly one of those, we recommend against granting an exclusive for the whole country. Particularly in the ICT field, Japanese companies are certainly familiar with moving to NDAs quickly, and they can move towards contracts quickly, so that sector does provide a contrast with more traditional sectors. I'd like to go over 3 sort of broad approaches to starting or expanding business in Japan, moving from a sort of lighter touch on the left all the way to a full income country presence on the right. An example of the first type, the agent and distributor relationship. Remember, an agent does not take title to your product, a distributor does. But one example of this kind of relationship was there was a Washington state company that sold tachometers for race cars, for people who were in the sport racing space. And believe it or not, they did sell product into Japan. But they needed to build a distributor relationship very carefully so that the distributor could distribute to all the sort of specialty hot rod shops where tuners in Japan go to buy things for their cars. A second method is a sort of a deeper partnership with a Japanese company. There was a company in Oregon that sold fruit products, and it tied up with a Japanese chain of family restaurants. And the Oregon company created a special product for this restaurant chain. It was a custom product. It was the base for a drink. It was organic fruit, cane sugar, and guar gum, and it was sold frozen in tubs. And the way that it was served in the restaurant was they would take a scoop of it and put it in a glass and add some fizzy stuff or some milk. And that business ran and ran. That was about a 10-year business. But it took a long time to build that relationship. But once it was built, the company in Oregon had to do very little to maintain it other than hit their supply commitments. And finally, the most involved is in-country presence. One example that I saw of this recently was in the outdoor equipment and clothing segment. A few weeks ago, I was in the village of Hakuba, which is in Nagano Prefecture in the so-called Japanese Alps. It's a ski town. And it's a village of 9,000 people, 9,000 permanent residents. And yet, walking through that village, I saw a standalone Patagonia store, a standalone North Face store, and a standalone store for Snow Peak, which is a very high-end Japanese outdoor brand. So for a high-touch product like that, that's going to be used in an extreme environment where the customer is going to want to touch and see and feel the product, then these companies have to establish their own presence, their own standalone stores. So those are sort of 3 broad approaches to doing business in Japan. You'll have to make a decision about which one matches your company's market and your own capabilities. So there is a sort of a final punch list for entering a market. Export readiness. One of the key elements of export readiness is buy-in from your own C-suite. Salespeople are aggressive and optimistic, and that's great for them to be. But you need to make sure that you have the buy-in from your company management and your production people. So it's great to go out and sell. Make sure that you bring the C-suite with you when you do. And then in terms of in-house capabilities, how are you going to manage the language difference? Do you have in-house language capability? How might you get that? There was a heavy equipment manufacturer in the state of Washington that was wanting to open the Asian market, and they decided they'd start in Japan. And they went to a local community college and found a Japanese student there in the business program, and they brought that student along, brought the student into the company. So the student had the bilingual capability, and they taught the student the business. But if you want to bring language in-house, there's a variety of ways to do it, and that is one. Second, research is paramount, and there's information on the internet is ubiquitous. I would start with the reports, the market reports that Trade Canada and your trade commissioners work to produce. Those are great sources of information that can help you orient yourself to what the key sectors are likely to be. Again, meet regulatory requirements, consider localization, vet your potential partners. There's a variety of ways to do that, from simple trade references to looking in the business press. I think that trade associations are an excellent way to vet potential partners. So find the relevant trade association in Japan. Typically, they'll have an English language webpage, and see whether your potential partner appears in the membership of your relevant trade association. And finally, consider, if you achieve initial success, how will you build on that? Will you ship into different locations? Will you add different things to your line? There's an old story about a pastor in West Texas, and his congregation had finally prevailed on him to pray for rain during a period of great doubt. And he reluctantly agreed. He got up into the pulpit, looked out over his congregation, and he says, "You've asked me here to pray for rain. Where are your umbrellas?" So be prepared for success, I think. I think it's important always to remember that. And then zooming out past Japan generally, the case for foreign trade is that it provides benefits to your business. It provides a source of revenue when your own domestic source may be down. It helps you to spread risk. And once you do enter a foreign market, it is important to stay engaged, to not take the relationship for granted, to look at how the society is shifting, to look at how customer preferences are shifting. It is a fact that you can now get frozen lobster in supermarkets here in Japan. Before, that would have all gone into the wholesale trade. So be aware of changing customer preferences. And thank you very much. We will be here to answer questions, and we appreciate being part of this event.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Suzanne back again. So I'm just going to facilitate some of the questions, and they've been pouring in through the chat and the Q&A features. I do want to pick up where we left off a bit with David, because some of the questions relate to supply chain, etc. And Bill was writing in earlier, to better understand what the concerns or obstacles are for building a reliable supply chain to Japan. And so David was talking to us about some transportation issues, and asking our companies to consider those as they bid or as they deal with their Japanese partners. But what's the practical solution, Andrew, that you can offer our companies who do need to put together a cost structure, who do need to satisfy a deal, should they get one, about shipping and getting their product into Japan, with the context that we're here on the East Coast of Canada?
Yes. First thing is, I would say, choose your own freight forwarder. Okay. Do not let your Japanese customer choose the freight forwarder for you. So you want your freight forwarder to be your advocate. And I would say get bids from at least 3. Okay. And yeah, there's a variety of ways that you could get from East Coast Canada. It could be, it could be all water. It could be a rail bridge. It could be air. It depends on what the product is. If it's a high value, relatively low weight, if it's, then you can fly it. But certainly you have an excellent rail service that will get you over to Deltaport and to Vancouver. And from there, it's probably a 12-day water transit to Japan. But again, work with a freight forwarder on your end. You want them to be your advocate. And then the freight forwarder will be able to recommend a customs broker, or if they don't provide that service themselves. The large commercial services, the large package delivery services, the blue team, the brown team. I used to work for the brown team, by the way, and they're great service, but they're very expensive. So after a while, you need to move beyond them and into dedicated freight forwarding service.
Thanks for that. That's a great tip, and we certainly do have some very qualified and local freight forwarders that we'd be very happy to connect anybody with, and with a lot of experience in getting our goods over to Asia in particular. Peng Wang has a similar type of question, Andrew, if you don't mind. And so we see that there's opportunities for a lot of our seafood forestry companies, which maybe tend to be larger firms, but what about our smaller scale traders, our SMEs? By definition, they're probably micro SMEs compared to SMEs in Ontario. But so what's a tip for the small company who maybe has a real good solution or a real good niche product?
Well, one, if it's a trade good, then look at consolidated shipments with your freight forwarder. But if you want to ship direct, then I would say, or if you want to deal directly with your customer, I would say do try an online sale through one of the reputable online marketplaces. People are shopping more and more. In our household, we shop for nutraceuticals. In our household, we do shop for nutraceuticals online. We get a CSA. I mean, that's not going to be relevant for Canada, but we buy vegetables online. So, the online marketplace is something to consider. The Japanese online marketplace, I think that this is in US dollars, I'm sorry, but I think the value of the Japanese online marketplace was 166 billion US dollars last year. So and again, with the pandemic, it is growing. But besides the Rakutens and SoftBanks, there's certainly Amazon is here.
Right.
So for SMEs, if you can get accredited by one of those larger online marketplaces, that will take a lot of your headaches away. But what's the kind of product you're thinking about specifically?
Well, there were some questions about the health products, and David rather alluded to, growing market for anything that's healthy, nutraceuticals, cosmetic products, you name it. And those
there's a wonderful network. Sorry, there's a wonderful service called iHerb, IHERB, for natural and nutraceutical type products. There's also Tengu Natural Foods, TENGU, or things like vegan margarine.
Great. And if you've dabbled in that sector, if you will, can you comment on whether there are some specific registrations or regulations for that sector, and where's the go-to for where all of these sectoral regulations or industrial standards might sit? Where can we direct people to?
They're on the front end. I would say start with Jetro, the Japan External Trade Organization, because they sit within the Ministry of Economy and Industry, and from the and your own consular personnel, your own embassy and consular personnel can be great door kickers.
Yeah. So and now we've got on the event site, so anybody can connect with David directly while we're live, or certainly after the fact, after he's got a good night's sleep, we can reach him tomorrow. Jetro, we've also got a link to Jetro on our resources page. So that's the Japanese trade organization, and they have offices, and we do have a relationship with them. I believe they're in Ontario. So that's great advice. I'll just go through another couple of questions here quickly, if you don't mind, Andrew.
Sure.
Oops. I missed the chat. So Louis is asking about what you're seeing in the aerospace and defense sector in particular. If there are some lines of business where Atlantic Canadian companies with their niche products or niche technical solutions might have a chance at penetrating that marketplace.
Sure. I will caveat this with saying this is not my area of specialization. I was sort of in clean tech and in ag,
Okay.
but certainly I think most people don't realize that Japan has the fifth largest defense budget in the world.
No.
And it is beginning to it's got a substantial navy. Japan has a maritime self-defense force, and as it calls itself, but it's almost a blue water navy. Japan has sort of some unique geographical challenges. Its mountains are very high, its valleys are very steep, so it's busy lofting up satellites so that it has uninterrupted cell phone access, cellular access all over the country. Japan maintains its own constellation of geosynchronous satellites. So the Japan JAXA, the Japan version of NASA, JAXA, I think they're pretty open to foreign partnership. Um, so I think that lots of these communications birds that are being lofted right now are pretty small. So anything to do with sophisticated communication, tactical communication, radios, even, I don't know, Japan doesn't have any military units that are forward based, of course, but they might look at foreign supply for things like, even snow shovels or boots or clothing. I certainly know that there were American outdoor outfitters that sold to the warfighter market.
Okay, that's an interesting angle.
Japan buys fighter aircraft from the U.S. and everything on down. I know that the Canadian Navy operates sort of frigates in combination with the U.S. fleet. They're interoperable, and Japan's warships are similarly sized. They're sort of destroyers. So it's a tough market. It's hard to see into, but I would say, yeah, do go through probably Jetro.
Andrew, where can we direct people to find out more checklist, if you will, fact sheet, source of information that you would readily refer clients to better understand the Japanese customs and traditions and best practices? How you've mentioned several in your deck, and we'll be making the decks available, obviously. But is there a source we can go to after to not miss out, to not misstep, if you will, when dealing with potential new Japanese partners, business partners?
I think it's a great question. I think culture is still important, and again, in one of my three things I want people to take away is sort of have fun while you do business, and what that means really is choose as part of your market selection process. You've got to look at the presence of your key demographic, or you've got to look at whether your product is going to sell there, but you also have to choose a culture that you like, or choose people that you can find a way to like and respect. And I think that's absolutely essential. Do find a way to acknowledge culture. Now, a great business deal can go a very great way towards alleviating any cultural rough spots, right? If you've got a great product and a great sort of business proposition, culture will probably not derail you, but you don't want to make any avoidable missteps, certainly. In terms of figuring out how to do business in and with Japan, again, your trade commissioners or people like me and organizations like ours are happy to serve as a resource. But I can sort of give you a sort of an omnium gatherum of sources. The 1990s book on Sony that I think is just called Sony is an excellent read about how a family company works. There is a book put out by NTT Press. NTT is Nippon Telephone and Telegraph. And it is called Business Otsukiai, Otsukiai, I think. And this was sort of a 3-ring binder that the telephone company had created for its managers. It's like, here's how we do things. And it got so popular, and managers in the company started handing it out, lending it to friends so much that NTT finally just created a press and published this thing. And it has tips like, if you're sending out invitations, mail invitations to an event, use the largest and most colorful commemorative stamp you can find so that your envelope sticks out. And it gives, it tells you how to behave at a company funeral. Most of us probably won't need to know that, right? But it is an encyclopedia of business etiquette. Now that's way deeper than you may want to go. Your local Japan-Canada societies are more than likely to have periodical refreshers on etiquette, as will the Japanese embassies and consulates in Canada. So they will be great resources on business etiquette and tips.
Thank you so much for that additional information. So folks, it's 2 minutes after 11. My apologies again for the slight delay in getting Andrew hooked up so that we could actually hear his presentation, but I'm sure you'll agree that he's shared some very valuable information with us this morning. And so with that, Andrew, a great big thank you to you, and especially for your time and effort in the lead up as you put together the deck for us.
Thank you for having us.